Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on Testify Podcast, and today I'm joined by R.G. Price, and today we're going to be talking about his book, Deciphering the Gospels Prove Jesus Never Existed. The link to purchase it will be in the description below in the pinned comment. That being said, R.G., thank you for joining me today.
Hey, good to be here again.
So, what would you like to start off? Because last time we were talking about your analysis of the Gospels and what kind of details in there you think indicate that they probably were aware or that there was awareness that Jesus was not literally a historical figure.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, what I really kind of would like to talk about is just the whole concept of challenging the academic consensus on this subject. And it's something that I think is interesting because my background is, not necessarily academic, but I definitely come from a background of being involved in atheist and skeptic communities. I mean, I myself am an atheist, but going back to the early 2000s, I was involved in various atheist communities and skeptic communities. If you're not familiar with the term skeptic, it would be communities. Skepticism is really more about questioning. Um, in many ways, claims that are not supported by science and often the academic consensus. So, a lot of times dealing with things like paranormal activity or, moon landing denial or vaccine denial or the promotion of intelligent design, things like that. And so within those communities, you might think that those communities of people would be very receptive to the idea that maybe Jesus never existed because you think, oh, you're atheist, whatever. But actually, that's not really the case. There's a lot of skepticism of even the idea of claiming that Jesus never existed among a lot of atheists and certainly skeptics because of the fact that it is a claim that challenges the academic consensus in the field of biblical scholarship and Christian history. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So what I think is interesting is when I first published my book, Deciphering the Gospels, proves Jesus never existed, and it's got that proves Jesus never existed in the title, which I put in for a reason. But when I offered to present, something about my book at local atheist community, they turned me down and said, no, we don't want you to present on something like that because we don't think it's possible to prove anything like that. That's an unsupportable claim, and we don't support that kind of stuff. That's like a conspiracy theory type thing. So I thought that was interesting, given that it was an atheist an atheist organization. But it makes sense, right? And that's one of the things that I kind of want to address is the fact that, especially in today's day and age, for the past 20 years, really, but now maybe even more than ever, there's a lot of concern about sort of the erosion of truth and a growing lack of distrust in academic institutions and academic consensus. And so I think there's a lot of people who view claims that challenge academic consensus, whether it's on something like creationism or vaccine efficacy, anything like that, as being these are unfounded, not rooted in rigorous methodologies and things like that. And so there's a sort of very understandable reaction to be opposed to any of these sort of claims that really go against the consensus in any field of expertise. But I think that this particular subject is an exception to the rule, and I think that that's an area where many atheists and skeptics and anybody who really has an interest in sort of paying attention to the views of experts and academic and what an academic consensus is on any given field. I think this is the area of biblical studies and Christian history is a specific area that is different from most others. And so it's an area where I think the academic consensus is not as well supported as it is in pretty much any other field. Do you have any thoughts on that, Jacob?
No. Whatever evidence or new analysis have you come up with since the book came out? What or any more developed thoughts on the issue?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about when I published Deciphering the Gospels, that book was put together. It was actually material that I put together for a website over a period of, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. And almost all of that analysis that I did was completely all my own reading of the Bible and the works of the church fathers. And I really did almost zero research, within the field of what other biblical scholars had done, other than a couple of writings by other than a couple of books by Dr. Robert M. Price. This new book that I'm working on is completely the opposite of that. So the new book that I'm working on, I've basically, ever since I published that book back in 2018, I've spent, I've read probably over 100 books at this point, books and publications on biblical scholarship by pretty much everybody going back to the 1800s. So this is coming from, the new book that I'm working on is coming from a very different place in terms of the my own background and understanding, but it is very much still focused on the same overall thesis. And I think I'm able to build a much stronger case now, having done a lot of that additional research compared to the first book that I put out. So I'm really looking forward to getting this book out. I've got basically the whole rough draft done, and at this point all I've got to do is go through, do a set of final edits, and I'm still working on trying to get a publisher, but if not, I'm not going to wait around. I'll self-publish it if I need to, especially in the current environment. Getting publishers for stuff that's controversial like this is a bit challenging, so may end up having to self-publish it again, but that's okay, because it's going to be, I think, a pretty big advance over my prior book.
When do you date the Gospels?
Well, that's something I've tried to somewhat shy away from, because I think sequence is something that's much easier to determine from the analysis. It's much easier to determine the order in which things happen than necessarily exactly when they happened. But if I have to put some dates on things, it actually is a pretty narrow range that I think is the most likely cases and likely scenarios. And my view is that the gospel, the very first gospel, the gospel, a precursor to the Gospel of Mark, well, let's just call it Proto Mark, I think would have probably come out in the late 90s, early or very first decade of the second century. My view is that the very first writing was probably something specifically about Paul, not a gospel story. That I think the first narrative was a narrative about Paul. And I think that narrative was likely based on the writings of Josephus. So if you look at when Jewish War was published, was in around 77. But then Antiquity of the Jews was not until around, I think it was like 97. And then The Life of Josephus came out, I believe, in 99. I mean, those dates may not be totally firm. I don't know that anybody knows exactly. But in the late 90s is when a lot of Josephus's work came out beyond Jewish War. And then, so I think a lot of the stuff came out right after those publications by Josephus. And, there's various scholars that want to put certain works after the Bar Kokhba revolt. That pushes things back quite a bit, into the 130s. I don't know that I would push a lot of the original writings, the very first writings, that far forward in time up to the 130s. I mean, certainly a lot of activity happened after that, and I think that there was a lot of additional development occurred, but I don't think that that's when the very first writings came out. So I think those very first writings, a narrative about Paul, Pauline letters, Proto-Mark, I think all of that is prior to the 130s, sometime between the mid 90s and the 130s is when all that happened, I think.
So what else is new that's upcoming?
Well, I do want to get back and address a little bit of the matter of whether or not questioning the status quo or the academic consensus on the existence of Jesus is something that even makes sense or should even be entertained. And I think it is absolutely a valid thing, and here's why: is because almost every single other field of academia is really dominated by secular institutions and methodologies that put scientific method and objective analysis at the forefront of their approach. And that is not the case in biblical studies and Christian theology. I mean, of course, there is no real field of biblical studies. That's not really a thing. You don't go to college to get a degree in biblical studies. There is no career in biblical studies. You go to college to get a degree in theology or divinity, in which a part of that is focused on biblical studies, learning languages, and then there's a whole bunch of other things that are involved in a theology or divinity degree that don't have anything to do with history or origins or anything like that. And of course, a lot of that is the goal of seminary programs is to produce religious leaders and religious scholars. It is certainly not the goal of these programs is not to provide objective critical analysis of these works and to question the origins of Christianity. That happens sometimes, but that's not the goal of these programs. Certainly the goal of all seminary programs is to graduate Christian leaders, right? And one thing I think is interesting that if you think about the way that seminary programs work and sort of the fields of education that exist today, there was a time when every single field of education fell under the purview of the church and was all run by seminary programs. All universities were religious institutions when you go back to the 14 and 1500s, right? And then as various fields started developing to where they challenged the theology, like astronomy and things like this, then they started separating from the control of theologians and things like that. And it really wasn't until the 17 and 1800s in the United States, and then after some of the revolutions in Europe, where non-religious universities started to be created, developed by taxpayer funding and things like this, instead of being set up by churches, that you really started getting secular academic programs. And one by one, these various fields got separated away from the church and separated away from theology. And of course, one of the last for that to happen was biology, right? And of course, I think as most people know, Charles Darwin, his education came from seminary school. Charles Darwin went to seminary school. Seminary school was the only place you could get an education in what was called naturalism at the time, because that was viewed as the study of the creation prior to Darwin. So there was a time when, not that long ago, only about 150 years ago, when biology was still a field that was under the purview of religious institutions, and you went to theologians to learn about biology. But we can see that one by one, all of these subjects have broken away from the theologians. They're now run through secular institutions. There's secular academic programs. But the one field that's still dominated by theologians is, of course, biblical studies and Christian history, because everybody assumes, well, of course, Christians would be the ones that would, only interested in those fields, and nobody really goes to school. You don't go to get a PhD in biblical studies. Certainly, there are people that go to get a PhD in antiquities, classical history, classical literature, things like that, that may venture into biblical studies, like Richard Carrier and people like that. But it's not really a field that for which there is a profession, right? You can't go to school to say, oh, I'm going to study to be a critic of the Bible. That's just not really a thing. So biblical studies is sort of the last area of academia that still falls under the purview of Christian theologians. And absolutely, their approach to studying the Bible, trying to understand how it was developed and all of this, is heavily biased by their religious beliefs. And that's true in that field in a way that it isn't in any other field of academic pursuit, like, antiquities or anthropology or biology or chemistry or anything else. And so that, I think, is a reason why, even if you're somebody who, puts a strong is a strong supporter of academic consensus generally, I don't think this is a field where academic consensus means the same thing as it does in pretty much any other field of academic pursuit, because it is so dominated by religious bias.
So I know you wanted to respond to an individual, that scholar, Dr. Sarah, as a critique of your book.
Yeah, and I mean, Dr. Sarah's on the Free Thought blogs, the Geeky Humanist. She's a great example of this, and we've traded communications back and forth, and I'm appreciate her critiques and stuff of my book. But I think she's a really good example of the type of mentality that I'm talking about, which I totally understand. It makes a lot of sense. Like I said, we're in a time when there's a lot of concerns about the erosion of truth and a lack of support for academic consensus. And so I think that's where she's coming from, is that perspective of, hey, wait a minute, saying that Jesus never existed, or just challenging Christian origins in general, whether or not whether you're talking about something like at will or any of these theories about Roman provenance or anything like that. Even if you aren't saying necessarily that Jesus never existed, but it didn't happen the way that the traditional story that is told by that you learn in church, and that is told by the Catholic Church, and that even that Protestants generally support. If you don't support that story, it must be some crazy conspiracy theory. And I don't think that's the case. And I do like to compare it to what went on with evolution. There was a time prior to the publication of Darwin's theory of evolution when there were many people who were putting forward a variety of ideas about how life on Earth developed. And if you look back to the 1600s, 1700s, and early 1800s prior to Darwin, there were dozens upon dozens of origin theories that were all a little different, that all, if we look back today, they seem a little wacky. Of course, Lamarck is one of the ones that is often used as an example, as the Lamarckian theory of, thinking, animals over time, if they needed to reach more, their necks would grow and stretch to, become like a giraffe or something like that, which is not how it works. But if you look back, what you can see is that we had the theological claim that, the Bible, either the Bible was literally true and that there were 6 days of creation and that's how it all started, or at the very least, all life on Earth was designed by God through an intelligent process where he, specifically, molded each living organism to its specific niche and role in life, and how it was going to eat and survive and all this kind of stuff was all planned out by one intelligent being, right? And that was the academic consensus. And there were dozens upon dozens of people challenging that academic consensus, and there were a variety of different ideas. Some of them were crazy, some of them were a little weird, some of them were similar to Darwin's theory of evolution but weren't quite there, and none of them could quite prove out their case. But the reason there were so many of those proposals happening in the 1700s and early 1800s is because there were enough people that knew that the standard religious explanation of life on Earth couldn't possibly be true. So they knew that what the church was saying about how life originated and developed couldn't possibly be true, but nobody had yet come up with an explanation that sort of satisfied all of the criteria of being logical, coherent, and supported by evidence, right? And so that wasn't until Darwin came along that he finally put forward this massive mountain of evidence, and this, one overarching theory that accounted for all this evidence, that people finally said, okay, here's something that finally can explain it and disproves this other theory. And I think that's where we are in Christian origins right now, where there's a lot of people who can see that the traditional explanation of Christian origins can't possibly be true. It sounds very, the traditional explanation of Christian origins sounds very plausible at face value. When you think about it on the surface, you might think, oh, well, this makes sense. There was a guy, he did some things, people wrote about it, it developed into a religion. What's the big deal? But there's enough people now that have looked into all the details, many of them theologians, right? I mean, a lot of this started back in the 1800s when Protestant theologians started really digging into all this and then realizing, hey, wait a minute, none of this adds up. But so there's enough people that now can see that traditional story just does not add up. There's no way that that can possibly be true, but nobody has yet come up with a completely solid explanation that has a sort of smoking gun that is supported by the evidence, that people can say, oh, well, this, sort of like the theory of evolution has got so much evidence in support of it that it proves that this must be the alternative explanation. So that's where we're at, is there's a lot of people out there that know that the conventional explanation isn't right, but nobody has yet come up with that solid smoking gun alternative explanation of Christian origins yet.
So why do you think that Jesus' character was created?
Well, there's a couple of possibilities, and I think I'm open to there being a few different possibilities, but my predominant view would be that it's a completely fictional character, and that the character of Jesus is very much associated with the character of Paul, and that all of this came out of the political and cultural environment in the wake of the First Jewish and Roman War, and in the build up to the Bar Kokhba revolt, or the Third or Second Jewish Roman War, however you count it. And so, as in that environment where Judaism had been, largely was under attack, it had, suffered some tremendous losses and changes. The temple was destroyed. A lot of the practices, the tithing and stuff that had all been done, was all disrupted. And that it was in this environment that these stories developed. And actually, when you look at Paul, sort of the character of Paul as he emerges from the Pauline letters and Acts of the Apostles, he shares a whole lot of traits in common with Josephus. In that, Paul is this figure that is supposedly he's a Pharisee. He's an expert in Judaism. He says in Galatians and in the stories that he basically has this expert understanding of Judaism, but better than all of his other peers, which is something that Josephus said about himself as well. And then Paul becomes a prisoner of the Romans. He's taken to Rome as a prisoner, and in Acts of the Apostles, of course, he ends up basically going free and preaching about the God of Abraham to the Romans, which is exactly what Josephus did. Josephus was, taken prisoner in war. He's taken to Rome. He eventually was freed, lived under the protection of Vespasian, and preached the God of Abraham to the Roman people. And when you look at the beginning of Antiquity of the Jews, it is all about that. It talks about, God, and he even calls God the Father. Josephus says, everybody needs to know that God the Father is, the creator of all things and all this kind of stuff. And Josephus talks repeatedly about how God's favor, that God sort of had raised up the Israelites and taken them under his wing, but that God's favor was turning from the Jews to the Romans. And he even says in his writings that God now resides in Italy. He no longer resides in Jerusalem. And so Josephus claimed that the God of Abraham, had these prophets, and Josephus himself used prophecies that were about the destruction of the temple and the sacking of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. He used those writings from the prophets and kings to argue to the Romans that these were prophecies that God had issued through his prophets that predicted Rome's conquest of Judea. So Josephus argued to the Romans that the God of Abraham was the one true God, and that they should worship the God of Abraham because God had sent his own prophets to foretell Rome's conquest of the Jewish people. And this is an argument that Josephus made to the Romans. And this is essentially the argument that we see fundamentally being made in the Pauline writings and the Gospels, right? And especially it comes out really strong in the Gospel of Mark. It's this same concept, right? And all of this, I think, goes back to Josephus. And I'm not saying that Josephus started this religion or anything like that. I'm saying that this is a set of ideas that we see voiced by Josephus, and that must have also been current in other communities, as well, and may have even been inspired by his writings. And so that's why I think, a lot of this came out likely around the same time, shortly after his major writings did in the 90s, because they sort of exemplified this idea that the God of Abraham had prophets who issued prophecies that were fulfilled by the Romans, which proved that God was now on the side of the Romans, and that they should worship him. And a part of this was, look what God did to the Jews. He punished them. He destroyed them because the Jews had displeased him. You, the Romans, God's now on your side. You can see what he did to them. You should worship him because you don't want him to do that to you too. And that was, I think, basically the case that Josephus made to the Romans. And I think that is, in many ways, the case that is made through the Gospels as well.
Could you go back to the complications and the sequential development of the Gospels?
Yeah, so I think one of the big problems in the general approach that most theologians take to trying to understand the Gospels is it's way too simplistic, for one thing, and the conventional understanding of Christian origins sort of requires that the canonical Gospels are the first and earliest gospel writings, right? So the church fathers, of course, said that they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, two of which were supposed to be direct disciples of Jesus, two of which were supposed to be associates of, one associate of Peter and the other one associate of Paul. But those are supposed to be the very first writings. And it's important that those are the very first writings because there's all these other gospels that are supposed to be heretical forgeries. And the argument of the church fathers is that we can prove that our gospels are true because our gospels are attributed to named people that were actually present, when Jesus was around, and all these other writings have to have come after ours. They are corruptions of the originals, and so that was central to the whole argument against these other works, is that since ours are first, those are all corruptions. And most theologians today still take that approach, even if they will push the dating of the Gospels back and say, well, okay, maybe the Gospels weren't written until after the First Jewish-Roman War. Maybe they were written in the 70s or even the 80s or 90s, or some would even date the Gospel of John, pushing it even into the 2nd century. But they still want to view those as the earliest Gospels, and nothing came before them, and they still relate only to one another, and they don't have to worry about things like Marcion's Gospel or Valentinian Gospel or anything like that. Now, of course, as you've interviewed plenty of people on your site that are now starting to challenge that, Marcus Vincent and others. But that's been a very long time coming, and it's been a very difficult thing. But it's not even just Marcion's Gospel. I mean, there were dozens upon dozens of these writings, and I am very confident now, as will be come out in my new book, that even the Gospels that we know of are not all the versions of the writings, and that there were other even earlier writings which were not mentioned by the church fathers, and for which we don't have any extant, remnants of. But I show in my book how, through literary analysis, we can determine that certain passages were added and certain passages were modified in the various Gospels. And so I think that there was a lot of change that happened before the current canonical Gospels even came into existence, and some of the other ones that we know. And one of the things that's been really difficult is that I think there's been this sort of cyclical modification where you have Gospel A or Gospel B is derived from Gospel A, but then somebody takes Gospel A and then modifies it based on material that was added in Gospel B. So now you have the source that was used for Gospel B. There's now a new version of that incorporates parts of Gospel B into what the original source was. And this kept happening over and over again through a lot of these different copies of it. So there's so much multiple layers of corruption and modification where later versions of the story were written back into earlier versions of the story, and it makes things extremely complicated to sort out. And that's, I think, something that most biblical scholars up to this point haven't really even wanted to contemplate or try to address. Now, there actually were some back in the 1800s, in the Tübingen school in Germany, that did get into a lot of this, and it got really complicated really fast. And a lot of that by the early 20th century was people, the academic consensus among the theologians was to just disregard a lot of that work, because it was clearly leading down a path of basically showing that all of the gospels were not had no reasonable legitimate basis. That they were showing that these gospels were literary products, they were derived from Pauline letters, they were derived from other Pauline writings, that they were all invented stories that were building on top of each other, and so a lot of that got shut down in the early 20th century. And then that's where we got into basically from the early 20th century through to really the 90s was a pretty static time in biblical scholarship, where certainly there were some things happening, and there was advances in understanding of Marcion and things like that during that time, but it was very much a holding pattern around the sort of traditional understanding of Christian origin. There was a lot of defense of things that propped up the conventional understanding of Christian origins, with the whole investment in the field of oral traditions and all of this stuff, going back to trying to develop ways to justify the idea that all of these stories could tell us something meaningful about a real person and all that kind of stuff.
Do you think that the Pauline epistles went through a redaction in response to the Gospels, or do you think they looked like as they are now before the Gospels took shape?
Well, definitely yes. And the reason that that's an easy yes is because of the pastorals. So absolutely, the pastoral epistles were written after the Gospels, and are dependent upon the Gospels. So at the very least, the collection has 3 letters added to it that are post-Gospel. Now, were there other modifications that happened to the letter collection at that point? I think yes, also on that as well. And a fairly easy example of that is simply the opening to Romans. I think the opening of Romans, the first, whatever it is, 1 to 8 verses of Romans, 9 verses maybe, has been largely added after the Gospels. Now, how many other things were added after the fact? There's obviously a lot there to try to pick apart each little thing that may have been a post-Gospel modification. But I think there was at least some post-Gospel modification, yeah. But to follow up on that real quick, there was probably less post-Gospel modification of the Pauline letters than maybe what today we might expect, because there just simply wasn't a need to do a lot of it. There wasn't the idea that where we are now in biblical scholarship isn't where anybody was in the 2nd century when all that was happening. And so I don't think that there was a huge need. Oh, there is another place that I think is another clear post-Gospel modification, and that's Galatians 2, 7, and 8. The only 2 mentions of Paul, the name Paul, in the original Pauline letters is Galatians 2, 7 and 2, 8. I can't quote the whole thing off the top of my head right now, but anyways, it's where Paul talks about being the apostle to the Gentiles, and Peter's the apostle to the uncircumcised, and Peter's the apostle to the circumcised. That's the only two places where the name Peter is actually used, and everywhere else it's Cephas. And so that also, I think, is a post-gospel modification, using the name Peter as it appeared in the Gospels and writing it back into the letters.
And when do you think all of that took place?
Yeah, I mean, that probably was, I mean, if I were to guess, I would say that was probably middle of the 2nd century. And I will say, I mean, I'll talk about a few things that are in my new book, and several scholars, and I think I even gave a presentation too here where I back the same position, have put forward Polycarp as the potential editor and modifier of what we would call the first edition of the Orthodox New Testament. I, in this book, suggest that it may have been Justin the Martyr, or students of Justin's right after he died. Of course, a big factor in that is that it was really only in the late 160s or early 170s that the Diatessaron was published. And that's really the earliest witness to the 4 Gospels, because that, of course, is the harmony. That's the harmony of all the 4 canonical Gospels. And while we don't have an existing copy of it, there were enough studies that were published on it in the 2nd through 5th centuries that remain, that we can be really confident that it was a very it did a very good job of incorporating virtually every single verse in the 4 now canonical Gospels. And it included the long ending of the Gospel of Mark, and it concluded all of John chapter 21. So it included, elements of the 4 canonical Gospels that would be potentially the latest additions. So the publishing of the Diatessaron had to have, is sort of our earliest, or sort of the latest point at which the 4 Gospels could have been assembled together. And we know that Justin Martyr did not appear to have known the canonical Gospels. He appears to have known a set of Gospels that was probably 4 Gospels without names, that were extremely similar to the canonical Gospels, but that had a few differences based on the things that he describes. For example, when he describes the birth of Jesus, he mentions Jesus being born in a cave, which is not in the canonical Gospels. So he had some form of the Gospels that was not exactly the same as the canonical Gospels, but they were really, really close. And so when you go from Justin having almost the canonical Gospels to and dying probably around 165, and then in around 170, the Diatessaron being published with the exact 4 Gospels, and the Diatessaron was published by a student of Justin's, I forget his name, Tatiana, whatever. A student of Justin's is the one that published the Diatessaron. So somewhere between Justin writing first apology, second apology, and his dialogue with Trypho, and the publication of the Diatessaron by a student of Justin's, the 4 Gospels came together. So that narrows that down to a pretty narrow time frame in the 160s.
Can you give us a little tease of what is to come in your new book?
Well, I mean, I think my new book focuses, like my old book, which I was actually trying not to do this, but I ended up doing it anyway, on the Gospel of Mark. Although the new book is about a lot more of the Gospels than the Gospel of Mark, but the really central aspects of it are analyzing the Gospel of Mark, and I'm not going to get into some of the most interesting findings just yet. But one thing I will say is that one thing that I think I show quite conclusively is that the Gospel of John is based on the earlier version of the Gospel of Mark, and that there are elements of the Gospel of John that are more original than any of the other Gospels. So one of those things being that you'll know in the Gospel of John, John the Baptist is never arrested and killed. And the reason for that is because in the first story, John the Baptist was never arrested and killed. And the Gospel of John is derived from a version of the Gospel of Mark in which John the Baptist was never arrested and killed. There's several other things about the Gospel of John that reflect the earlier version of the story. So I think that's something will be quite interesting.
Do you think that the synoptic problem, like when you look at how to solve it, do you see the Gospels as kind of using each other? And how do you look at Marcion's Gospel as well, and how it integrates into the issue?
Well, yeah. So I mean, that is a part of the problem in it. And so I think there are definitely parts of the canonical Gospel of Mark that have been derived from the Gospel of Matthew. And so I think that's an example of how there was an earlier version of the Gospel of Mark. That earlier version of the Gospel of Mark was used to create an earlier version of what we would call the Gospel of Luke. So it was like Proto-Mark. Proto-Luke was based on Proto-Mark, and there was a Proto-John based on Proto-Mark. And then we had other versions built on those. And then when you get to the canonical version of Luke and Mark, those have both been redacted to conform to Matthew, because Matthew took those sources, made modifications to many of the modifications that Matthew made were done for the purpose of countering Marcionite and Gnostic type teachings that were done to demonstrate that Jesus was a human being that was born on earth, had an ancestry, had a parents, and all these things. He came from Nazareth and all this kind of stuff. And then many of those changes that were added in by the writer of Matthew were then added back into Mark and Luke after they had been made by Matthew. So I think that's an example of some of the complications of Matthew's built on Mark and Luke, but then parts of Matthew were used to modify the versions of Mark and Luke that we have in the canonical New Testament. And I know some of that may sound wacky and crazy, but I swear I've got evidence to back it up.
So one last question before we close is, where do you think things are going to go from here? Do you think mythicism is gaining ground, or is it too early to tell?
Well, I think that it's interesting because right now there's so much going on in the world that's kind of hard to tell what's going to go on with anything. But in terms of our understanding of Jesus, we've got a whole lot of different things going on right now. From a popular perspective, right, we've got television shows like Chosen and all these kind of things that I think a lot of people really, they view these shows and it presents this sort of popular, easy to understand, digestible story that seems to make a lot of sense and seems very plausible, right? By the same token, in terms of academic biblical scholarship, there are, I think, too many credentialed theologians that have gone too far down the road of challenging many of the fundamental assumptions of traditional biblical scholarship for that genie to be put back in the bottle. So I think even if, people like myself and Richard Carrier and Dr. Robert M. Price don't end up making an impact, I don't know that the field of theology is going to be able to continue to support the traditional understanding of Christian origins for much longer, because right now I've read over 30 papers that talk about the dependency of the Gospel of Mark on Pauline letters. So, and once you start understanding that, it starts to unravel the whole framework that traditional biblical scholarship is built on, as far as having these multiple independent sources that were developed by independent communities, and all of these similarities across works from these independent communities and independent sources corroborate existence of these things. And a quick example would be like the Eucharist ritual, right? So the Eucharist and the Last Supper, traditional biblical scholarship tells us that we have the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew as one witness to this tradition, and we have the Pauline letters and possibly the Gospel of Luke as another witness to this tradition. So we've got at the very least 2, if not 3, sources that are supposed to corroborate, that they're supposed to be independent, sort of testimonies to the fact that there was some Eucharist ritual. So we can say, oh, well, we know that that was something that really existed in Christian communities because we have multiple people reporting on it, quote unquote. But once you recognize that this is something that was invented in the Pauline letters, where Paul says, this came to me as a revelation from the Lord, and then it was copied from the Pauline letters into the Gospel of Mark, and it was copied from the Gospel of Mark into the Gospel of Matthew, and it was copied or into the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. And it's all just one chain of literary development that originated with somebody making something up. Now you can no longer say, hey, wait a minute, we know that the Eucharist ritual is something that came from Jesus, and it's something that he told people to do, and this is a ritual that goes back to the founder of the religion. That's where traditional Christian scholarship still is, but there's way too many challenges to that narrative, even among academic credentialed theologians from seminary schools at this point, I think, for that view to last very much longer. And so I think that's just going to happen, in short order, whether or not people, like I said, out from outside of these institutions make an impact or not. Too much of it is going to crumble from within, I think.
So I'd like to remind everybody real quick about the link to purchase the book by R.G. Price, Deciphering the Gospels, Prove Jesus Never Existed, will be provided in the description below in the pinned comment. That being said, R.G., thank you for joining me today.
Okay. Talk to you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.